My wife is a clinical psychologist. Stanley Hoffman's wife is a clinical psychologist. She spent a year having seminars on heroes. And she invited heroes from all walks of life. And she told us about it and said they had one thing in common. The thing that they had in common is they never thought twice. They just did it. They didn't reminisce, they didn't figure it out, they didn't intellectualize it. Whatever it was they did it. And if you ask them why, they say, I don't know. I mean, that was the thing to do, wasn't it? And no one knows whether, when the moment arrives, when it's possible, makes a difference, how you'll act. But we know how they acted. And why do I say of Elliot Richardson? I say that of Elliot Richardson because he was a career politician. And at that moment, he gave up his career. And why did he give it up? And this strikes people probably under, the age of 40 anyway now, is really weird. He gave it up because he promised the United States Senate that he would not fire Archie Cox under these circumstances. And to make a promise to the United States Senate is making a promise to the American people. Now that's built into him. He didn't have to intellectualize that. And there we are. The chips are down. What do you do? And he quit. Okay? Good. We say in advance, tough for him. Probably tougher than we think. Now Archie, I got so much out of that relationship. Why? Well, it's easy to say looking up there, well, there's a man of integrity. Okay, I think he was a man of integrity. But I learned by watching, and I learned by talking, and I learned by associating with the people here those few months. Well, what does it mean? One thing it means, it's always meant to me, and I got that from him, is look, let's not talk, let's go do our job. Do the job. Do it as well as you can. He's not here to chase the president out of office. He said that many times. He's there to lead an investigation. And where the investigation goes, that's where he goes. So he hires a pretty good group of people there, and we're going to investigate. That's it. Do the job. And then if that job leads you into this alley where it's going to cause a lot of chaos because of what you just saw, well, then it is, okay? You do what you have to do.
I read in one of the newspapers this morning the headline, Cox Defiant. I do want to say that I don't feel defiant. In fact, I told my wife this morning I hate a fight. Some things I feel very deeply about are at stake, and I hope that I can explain and defend them steadfastly. I'm not looking for a confrontation. I've worried a good deal through my life about the problems of imposing too much strain upon our constitutional institutions, and I'm certainly not out to get the President of the United States. I'm even worried, to put it in colloquial terms, that I'm getting too big for my britches. That what I see as principle could be vanity. I hope not. In the end, I decided that I had to try to stick by what I thought was right.
Mr. Cox, you would seem to be in what we'd call a non-viable position now. Are you going to wait for the President to dismiss you?
I'm going to go about my duties on the terms on which I assumed it.
The issue of presidential authority versus the independence and public accountability of the special prosecutor was squarely joined. The President, at that point, thought he had no choice but to direct the Attorney General to discharge Mr. Cox. And I, given my role in guaranteeing the independence of the special prosecutor, as well as my belief in the public interests embodied in that role, felt equally clear that I could not discharge him. And so I resigned. At stake in the final analysis is the very integrity of the governmental processes I came to the Department of Justice to help restore. My own single most important commitment to this objective was my commitment to the independence of the special prosecutor. I could not be faithful to this commitment and also acquiesce in the curtailment of his authority.
When and why did Elliot Richardson and you decide to resign rather than fire Cox?
We were watching that press conference in the Attorney General's office at the Justice Department, and as I recall, we had discussed this sort of fleetingly before, but at the day before, the Friday before this press conference, Elliot and his assistants and I were sitting around discussing what the likely outcome of the White House's response to the special prosecutor's request would be. It seemed to us that the likelihood then was that the president would ask first Elliot and then me to discharge Cox. And we all looked at Elliot and said, what are you going to do if he asks you that? He said, well, I'll have to resign. And then they all looked at me and said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I don't think that there is any set of conditions under which it's possible to discharge Cox. It really didn't seem to a hard decision to me. Both Elliot and I had testified in being confirmed before the Senate that we would only discharge Cox for extraordinary improprieties. That phrase was used in our testimony. And not only had he not, in all of the dealings that both of us had had with him, had any extraordinary improprieties, he had pursued his duties in the most appropriate way possible. So there was no grounds for discharging him, so we both said no, we wouldn't do it.
I work with this document. I'm a judge, and I work with the Constitution. And if I listen to this, I mean, you put this, it's an amazing thing. I see it quite often. But think about what you heard in light of this document. I mean, in parts of it. Freedom of the press, an essential part. First Amendment. The independent judiciary. You heard how people who were appointed by President Nixon himself went on with decisions, along with decisions that would ruin President Nixon. An independent judiciary, grand jury. This is Article 5, Amendment 5. There it is. And that's what you're working with. I wrote a couple down here. The right to petition. What happened after Archie gave his talk? You saw those telegrams. The Senate oversight. The Congress overseeing the executive branch. That's called the separation of powers. Impeachment. An escape valve, not used, but the presence of it there resolved the problem. And what I think is the most important at all, which I think people mentioned again, look, Phil and I drove in once and he was telling me the same things exactly you're telling you. How do we know that President Nixon's going to go along with this? And moreover, maybe he'll just write a letter to Judge Sirica. Dear Judge, I'm very sorry, I can't do it, I have reasons. Who's going to appeal? Archie won. I mean, you see? And I asked that question to Charlie Wright, who was a professor, a very great law professor, advising President Nixon. And I put that conversation to him years later and said, why didn't you? And he said, we thought of it. We thought of it, but we couldn't. We couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. Now, maybe he's talking for himself. Maybe he's exaggerating. Maybe he's hopeful about what President Nixon was thinking. But they didn't do it. They followed the legal route. They followed, and you see that's what I think is the most important thing of all. To me, the rule of law, it held. It held. It was flexible enough to deal with this. The rule of law held, and believe me, I see it in other circumstances too.